Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the podcast. This is episode 30, and I am privileged to have as the guest for this episode, Steven Wang. Steven, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much, Will. It's wonderful to be here, and it's my first podcast, so it's great to be doing this with you.
Absolutely. Well, you have a very accomplished background, educational, professional career, and no doubt this will be the first of many future podcasts and other media experiences, I'm sure, that will touch upon your expertise and your passions.
Thanks.
All
Let's
right.
hope so. If I don't mess this up, so we'll see.
Well, it would be great to have this when you are on a major, I'm sure, major media channel someday. And, I can say that I had the privilege of having you on as a guest. For
Okay.
everybody who is listening in, I wanted to provide a little bit of background on Steven Wang. Steven is an accomplished attorney currently at Paul Weiss in Toronto and the New York offices. Was a legal career that spanned from at first at Corvath here in New York. Beyond his legal background, Steven is a social entrepreneur who founded a Gates Foundation supported initiative in China, has been recognized by the Forbes 30 Under 30, aiming at cultivating future leaders in social innovation. He is a Harvard Law graduate, a Rhodes Scholar, and Steven has even been a mentor for the Schwarzman Scholars in the Schwarzman Scholars program at Tsinghua University. He is also a global shaper in the World Economic Forum and brings a wealth of experiences in international law and U.S.-China relations. He's also one of the youngest lecturers at Harvard Law School, actually, just this upcoming fall. The seminar, I believe, is called Engaging China, which he'll be co-teaching with Professor William Alford, I believe, who is one of the pioneers in studying Chinese law in the U.S. and will, I'm sure, cover some of the biggest questions facing U.S.-China relations and so the world in the upcoming months, or years ahead, including trade, climate change, AI, Taiwan. Students at Harvard who have the opportunity of taking such a course, whether they're at the law school or other schools that allow them to cross-register, I think will definitely be interested in hearing. So, Steven, diving right in, your accomplished background. First of us, tell us about this lecture that you are choosing to do while you're having a full-time legal career, in Toronto, in New York. What made you end up pursuing this new adventure and being one of the youngest lecturers at Harvard Law School?
Well, thanks so much, Will, for that question. And obviously, it's a tremendous privilege to be able to have this opportunity to teach at Harvard. Never thought I would have a chance to study there, let alone teach. So, really grateful for the opportunity and the chance to work with Professor Alford, as you mentioned, who's really one of the great scholars of this field on China and U.S.-China relations. And I think for me, what's really interesting and exciting is that, there's no doubt U.S.-China relations is the most important bilateral relationship in the world. Whatever you think about it, it can't be ignored. But, as we all know, there are a lot of challenges facing it for many reasons. And the fact is, in this polarized environment, with media, some would say sort of a Cold War mentality, oftentimes the discussion in the broader discourse is very shallow or very black and white. And the fact is, it's a very complicated relationship with some adversarial competitive aspects, but also some cooperative dynamics that's going to be needed for the rest of the world. So what we wanted to do with this course, this seminar, is to really provide a space to really engage in robust, nuanced, open discussion so that we can bring different views across the spectrum to talk about both the past, the present, and the future of this relationship across all these issue areas you mentioned, that everything from climate change, trade, AI, things of that sort. And I think the other aspect that I think is really exciting about this is, aside from the substantive aspect, just even in this, again, world that we're living in where people are shouting past each other, no one really seems to be listening as much with sort of, civility and empathy, that I think this is a course that allows us to be able to model how do we have reasonable disagreements. And so that's, I think, another, hopefully, a pedagogical goal of this. So I'm really excited about it. And I think we're going to have some really exciting kind of elements to it. We're also doing some policy sort of writing briefs to give it. We're having, for example, the former Secretary of Navy come in to talk about South China Sea. I'm going to do a simulation to see what it's like to actually advise a principal from a legal and other, policy perspectives, and also just unpack some of these dynamics. How does negotiations go when you're cutting across different cultures, and what are the elements that go into policymaking? Because it's not just a leader at the top on either side, but there are all these other forces at play. For example, in the U.S. context, you got the Congress, you have the media, you have all different lobby groups, civil society, and so really trying to make sense of all of this, I think it should be really, really interesting.
Absolutely. And no doubt having the opportunity to teach some of the brightest law students in the country, if not the world, in one classroom who might need one day shape US China relations on the legal, in the policy perspective, in government or in the private sector. It'll be wonderful for them to perhaps have this specific exposure in the classrooms at Harvard Law School.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think, in particular in U.S. context, a lot of, as you, alluded to, Will, a lot of the decision maker, policy makers come from a legal background. So this is where I think the law school experience is unique, because we do have that grounding, but then we also recognize there's a lot of issues that are not, per se only legal, because there are policy, political, and many other dynamics at play. And so I think what will be interesting is, and this is where I think this would be great, if there are students out there who, obviously from the law school, we have a waiting list, but, definitely encourage others to sign up in case spots open up, and then also cross registration from other departments and across the campus if there's interest, because it'd be great to see how do these different perspectives from law, business, policy, and many other dimensions that I think all intersect, and that I think creates some really interesting discussions.
Absolutely. Well, it's wonderful to hear that the class is already full and there's so much interest. Perhaps we can get a little bit into some of the content later on in this episode for those that are interested in the subject, but wouldn't necessarily, for our audiences who aren't at Harvard Law School or a part of another graduate school program, to perhaps get a little bit of insight, and perhaps then they can learn a little something that you aim to distill and teach in the classroom this fall semester.
Absolutely, yeah, that'd be really exciting, and
Yeah.
and I'm sure I will learn a lot in this process in our discussions with our students. And we are at a very interesting moment too, Will, as you know, with the election coming up this fall, and so for example, even how China is discussed in that context, and how the outcome of whether it's a Harris administration or Trump administration, that will have a lot of effect on how things. So we're living right through it together. So it will be really interesting to follow this process together, and see where it all takes us.
Absolutely. Well, as much as the political context currently in the United States with the election, the rhetoric between U.S. and China has been particularly pungent for immigrants, and in particular Chinese American, Chinese Canadian immigrants who have lived in perhaps both worlds and share perspectives and a unique degree of understanding them others do not. I wanted to be able to, for our audience, to learn a little bit more about yourself, and in particular your extraordinary background and your story of being, from an immigrant from China to Canada, to your extraordinary educational path, and of course to the present day. But I would love for our audience to learn a little bit more, firstly, about your upbringing as an immigrant to Canada from China.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to. And, I think it's a story of many immigrants, not just within sort of the Chinese, East Asian communities, but across, around the world. And, it's like one of those stories where there's just a lot, kind of to be grateful for, because of a lot of what, my parents, and I'm sure many parents have done for their children. So I, was born in the northern China, Shanxi province, and immigrated when I was 9 years old, and grew up in a small town in Ontario, Canada, called Cambridge. So it's a funny thing that I spent a place in a couple other Cambridges. Yes, a good name. Yep. And I think it was interesting because it was a small town with predominantly Caucasian and much less minorities. And I think in a way, while I share definitely a lot of similarities with a lot of, upbringing, that experience of immigrants, learning a language from scratch, dealing with those cultural, kind of nuances. It was also interesting seeing these different dynamics. And I think in particular, seeing my parents who, kind of, I think for a lot of adults, at that point in life, I think just, want to kind of more stay within their comfort zone, but they really push to try to get to, meet like locals and learn, different things going on in the community and try to get integrated and kind of, stretch their sort of, what outside of their, comfort zone in ways. And I think that left an impression for me to say that, hey, if they're doing it, coming much later in life, me
Right.
coming younger, even though there's a lot of barriers, obstacles, like why can I, kind of take some more risks? So I think in some ways that gave me a little bit of courage. So for example, by the time I went to high school, and at that point my English was, much better and I was a little more integrated, but still, kind of shy, like a little, Asian kid, there was an opportunity in grade 10 to like run for student council president. Most of the time I wouldn't thought of the dream about doing it, but I was like, hey, maybe this is a chance to, kind of go for it and see what happens and practice a lot, giving a speech that, about something that I feel really passionate about our community and our school. And I was able to, get a chant going in the auditorium and eventually win this campaign. And then also later on started a community youth organization about how do we tackle some of these global problems in the world, but in a local way and kind of
Hmm.
bringing different folks from different backgrounds together. And so I think just at that point, I felt, kind of tremendously grateful to have had the, exposure and education I had and just kind of started becoming more curious about the world and eventually had a chance, in undergrad to go study international relations and go see the world, which, I'm happy to talk about as well.
Yeah, absolutely. At that point in high school, when you're kind of thinking about university, kind of what prompted you to pursue college in Canada versus perhaps elsewhere? For a lot of people who aren't necessarily familiar with the Canadian education system,
Right.
University of Toronto is one of the best universities in Canada, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, I think just, just benefited a lot from a really great public school, system. So, I obviously was also cheaper and was able to get some scholarships. So I thought, it was great to get that, foundation in undergrad. And it actually turned out to be a really wonderful experience at University of Toronto because I had a chance to go kind of see the world, studying international relations. I did some development work in Kenya. Building, kind of water wells and a health clinic. I spent a summer at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, trying to make sense of what was going on in the Middle East and this very complex history. And did a study abroad in Paris and Sciences Po, learning about, the European Union and what was, this really a new project of
Hmm.
integration across cultures. And so, but at the same time, what I also saw, I remember in Sarajevo, seeing the ethnic conflict and, children who were affected by war. Or, in Kenya, when I saw the tribal conflict of the Luos and Kikuyus during the presidential election and seeing how a lot of these
Hmm.
divisions across cultures, religions, tribes can take place and starting to feel that maybe there's some role as someone who grew up in different cultures that I could be a bridge in some very idealistic way and wasn't sure how to do that, but that I
Hmm.
think became more of a theme of that the need to transcend sometimes more narrow identities and ideologies to be a bridge in some way.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I think a lot of what you saw from your immigrant experience to seeing the diversity in both thought, perspectives, and of course the divisions, in these various countries that you've seen, has been really instrumental in shaping how one can become a leader, how one might have a vision for not just their local community or city or even country, but the world itself. And um, perhaps that was why, that helped motivate yourself to then, after your undergraduate journey, you applied and was successful in pursuing and receiving the Rhodes Scholarship, allowing you to then study at the University of Oxford for your first graduate degree.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think to your point, there's something about that chance to being exposed to other cultures and traveling and relating to people on a very human level that you develop a sense of empathy that you otherwise might not. And I recognize it's a privilege, right? Not everyone has a chance to go to these different places and to have that exposure. But having that benefit it certainly gave me a chance
Yeah.
to say maybe we could try to see where our commonalities. on a human level. And so, yeah, absolutely. So in terms of the Rhodes Scholarship, I think it was very much in that spirit, because Rhodes does talk a lot about fighting the world's fight, and public service, and then there's a very global context. And so when I was first exposed to it, I was kind of finishing up my undergrad. I just thought, there's no way I would be qualified for this kind of scholarship. It seems like really, really talented, smart people, yeah. So, I just thought, okay, this probably isn't for me. But, when I started thinking more about it and talking to some friends, I said, you know what, maybe I don't want to regret of not trying, because, and also the worst case scenario is that, in writing this personal statement, which you have to do for the Rhodes and many other scholarships, you kind of really crystallize your own sort of what your own mission and vision is for life, early 20s. So it's not by any means developed, but at least an attempt at it, which was a really interesting process. And so I feel tremendously grateful because obviously so many people were qualified, I think, to be a Rhodes Scholar at that point. And I think, in a way, I felt kind of winning the lottery. In whatever the case, I feel, it really gave me so much. And the time at Oxford was also quite transformative as well.
Absolutely. And like you said, right, there's so many qualified individuals, but you yourself had a very compelling narrative from your experiences that allowed you to then pursue this scholarship. I am curious about your time, and for our audience, the Rhodes Scholarship is one of the most selective and prestigious graduate scholarships in the world, where you have an acceptance rate that's close to 1, maybe 1.5% of applicants, and even those applicants themselves are some of the most stellar applicants produced within the global educational system. What was that experience like to study alongside so many extraordinary peers from the US, Canada, Africa, all around the world, during your 2 to 3 years, depending on if you're doing a master's or a little bit longer, during your time there?
Well, in a word, it was humbling because, as you said, you are really exposed to some of the, best and brightest minds, out there. And people often actually also talk about within the community this sort of feeling of imposter syndrome, because you always hear about these incredible people and, you're like, oh, somehow I got picked, do I even belong here? Do I have the, and do I have what it takes? And so, but I think along with that humility, which I think is really helpful, is also through that process where sometimes, I would have debates with, very intense debates with, friends and, whether it's Rhodes or other students studying at Oxford across the political spectrum, very different cultural backgrounds about big questions facing our world. And at first, I think I was trying to, really kind of prove my argument. This is why this position is correct. But soon, more and more, I realized actually I gained a lot more by trying to listen and understand where they were coming from and what is the basis for their view. Because I think in some ways, I'm under this kind of approach that I feel like there's often a grain of truth in many different positions, and no one has an exclusive, sort of monopoly on truth. And as a result, I think through that process of starting kind of humility, but then over time rebuilding a confidence, it's probably a more justified, more solid sense of confidence that's based off of exposing yourself and being open and testing out ideas. And so that process, that balance of that humility and confidence, I think really helped. And I think just in addition to that, just having this gift of time to be able to slow down, when we're all kind of on the treadmill trying to get somewhere, to be able to think, there are scholars who go, they're a doctor, but they end up studying theology because they want to explore some of the more moral, religious questions of what their practice involves or other things. And for me, so it was a chance to kind of explore some of these big questions along the theme that I've been starting to explore, which is how do you be a bridge across different divides. And in fact, the Rhodes Scholarship was very much at the time trying to, Cecil Rhodes, he obviously quite a problematic character himself, but at the time was thinking about how do you prevent an unnecessary war between, sort of the Anglo-Saxon world and Germany and the changing power dynamics. So in a way, I kind of maybe foreshadow with sort of what's similar to the Schwarzman Scholarship, thinking about how do we prevent an unnecessary conflict. Obviously there could be competition if there are competitive adversarial dynamics for sure, but how do we prevent, if something that happens that doesn't need to lead to catastrophic consequences for ordinary folks, because of a major conflict. And so thinking about those kind of questions and just kind of feeling that, hey, maybe I have the safety net now that Rhodes gives you to take some risks that otherwise you might not. So I decided, even though I had gotten into law school at that point, I decided to defer it and ended up deferring for 4 years and went to China to kind of to take this kind of a leap to do something different that I think than most people in kind of the professional, traditional kind of path would take.
Absolutely. It is definitely interesting, right? The path you've chosen and be to focus specifically on, how your journey has shaped to the Rhodes Scholarship, but more beyond that, the interesting part, which I think is, you were born in China, you immigrated to Canada, you've moved to UK, but you've studied across the world, taking from your Rhodes Scholarship experience and the mission of the Rhodes Scholarship of indeed fighting the world's fight. Why did you choose in this kind of next step in your journey to return, in a sense, home to China for work after the Rhodes Scholarship? What was your thought process to pursue
Yeah.
that? Because many Rhodes Scholars, after graduating from their degree, could have taken a very traditional route of taking a very highly paid at a top investment firm or a consulting firm, finance firm, perhaps, where gone on to further studies at that point in time. What made you choose to take, which in the at least was in that population, a slightly larger risk of being an entrepreneur and building kind of a social enterprise organization?
Yeah, it's a great question, Will. And there's definitely, quite a bit to unpack there. But, the first thing that made me think of you when you mentioned the word home is that, it's interesting how we think about home and how we think about identity, because it's maybe there's a sense that, and how that kind of conception evolved, right? Because I grew up in Canada and now I'm back in Canada and we can talk about later. And this is home for me, right? This is the place where I grew up and coming back for a circle after over a decade abroad. Really excited to be back and, but at the same time, actually, Canadians is a great example where people are very comfortable, maybe even more so than Americans. And I don't know what your thoughts on this is that, because maybe the national identity of what it means to be Canadian is perhaps looser. They call it kind of maybe a mosaic or a salable, less than a sort of a melting pot. People are very comfortable, whether various diasporas, of Indian background, Iranian, of Ukrainian background, of their cultural heritage. And so I think that recognizing that we have these different layers of identities, that you can be very proudly, for example, in my case, Canadian, but also a global citizen, but then also appreciate my, cultural heritage and Chinese cultural heritage. So I think, and that sometimes get lost, when we have, to your point earlier about some of these, anti-racism, about, Kung flu and things like that. So to your question about sort of why I decided to go to China and then start the social enterprise, I think in a nutshell, it was partly, kind of a curiosity about just, learning a bit more about my roots, like where did it come from, what did it mean? Because I find I don't know if you have your experience, American, Chinese Canadians or other immigrants, there's always at some point in your life, you start having some curiosity, like, hey, like, yeah, I'm very American or I'm very Canadian, but I also have this heritage, like what does it even mean? And it hits you at different points. For me, it was kind of more around the time of around Oxford and after that. And the way I wanted to go about that, along with this interest studying international relations, how do what is the relationship between East and West, China and West, and how do we manage that? How do we approach it? Was to say, I want to go on the ground to see, and not just, be an ivory tower, write a PhD or work in some fancy institution, but the first place I went was actually in Yunnan province, close to the Myanmar borders, like the very remote part of China, and at the edge of this kind of an empire of sorts, right? And it was a fascinating experience, to be honest. It was one of the most kind of interesting times of my life thus far, was because you can see I'm a bit dark, the audience see I'm a bit dark, but when I arrived, locals, I was worried, like they think this westernized elite guy, elitist, and they're like, hey, are you a local rural teacher? Because I'm kind of dark, because like I kind of blended right in with the locals. And after a year working there, having to deal with like the education bureau, the schools, the principals, and sometimes you have to even, localize a bit, drink a little bit of the Chinese baijiu, they call it, kind of a vodka, very strong, and
Yeah.
just kind of picking up some of the mannerisms. You kind of look like a village official. So I was like, I kind of upgraded, in their eyes in a funny sense, just in terms of sometimes how fluid these things are. And then from that experience of working in a very remote place, working in the nonprofit sector, recognizing that there was kind of, even though civil society is kind of conceived very differently in the Chinese context because of its political setup, philanthropy was actually very much on the rise as the economic development was happening, right? Because you had, for example, the Jack Ma's of the world, these entrepreneurs who made a lot of money and they were like, we want to also give back. What are we going to do with this? So they're setting up foundations in environment, poverty, education, but there wasn't really good, people to help run these organizations. So I kind of have an idea for sort of like Rhodes for a social service and place these young professionals with business skills and place them in nonprofit foundations for a year. And I was able to convince Gates Foundation in China to be our first donor and got others on board. And we did a launch at the Bird's Nest in the Olympic Stadium. And the whole message was to say, hey, like beyond just making some money, live a comfortable life, which is totally people are entitled to and it's important. But there's that sense of social responsibility that whether you're in China or other parts of the world, that, that in a way that's kind of a manifestation of some of the ideals from the Rhodes Scholarship as well. And so having the chance to do that, it was kind of unplanned and it just, a lot of entrepreneur experiences just kind of grew and just kind of took off.
Absolutely. Well, what was the experience like? I think you went to China, this is 2010 at this point, right? I believe that's kind of like
14 to 2018. So I was
right,
around, that period.
right.
Yep.
So it is 2 years after Xi Jinping becomes president of China. And between that time, I think that was around the peak of, I think, an age in which US and global perceptions of China was at near an all-time high. Chinese economy was growing. There was a lot of tremendous foreign investment and openness. And it was certainly around that time when the Schwarzman Scholarship was also the idea becoming actualized at Tsinghua University. What was your experience like? Of course, you being at that point a Canadian citizen, of operating in sort of a Chinese environment. You briefly mentioned, of course, the Education Bureau. You Chinese, Canadian, U.S., Western, legal systems, government systems are drastically different in some ways. In other ways, perhaps very similar in terms of how much effort it would take. What was your experience like interacting and kind of constructing an enterprise in some ways in which you are not directly a Chinese citizen, so you have to work within a completely different system than the one you're used to?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question, Will. And I can tell that you've obviously spent, some good amount of time as a short scholar in China because you can recognize some of these unique sort of constraints or contours of a different context. And I think for me, and I have to say, as you're pointing out, this is a very unique window because actually shortly after I went to law school, not just, the trade war started blowing up more, but then, for example, in Canada, we had you may have heard about the Huawei incident, about Mo and Joe. And then in response, the two Michaels, the two Canadians who were also, under detention, it would just
Right.
kind of continually deteriorated. And then since there's been, all these things about, foreign interference in Western democracy. So there was a lot going on that happened afterwards. So in a way, I was at a unique window before this process where, it was, at least on the philanthropy sector side, there was a space to kind of like, hey, we're, a lot of folks, whether it's people who made some money or whether it's, millennials who've come back from overseas and just kind of wanting a sense like beyond making money, we want to make a difference, define meaning beyond, just the day-to-day things. And I think it tapped into something that there was a sense, the and actually, China at the time had some really interesting ways of doing philanthropy. For example, this called September 9th by Tencent, where everybody crowdsourced like donations. You pick a charity on a mobile app and it just across the country. And this amount of money you fundraise in one day and just these social phenomena. And then you're also seeing, for example, in philanthropy, a lot of, those business entrepreneurs who've made some money and reaching out to, those in the U.S. with working with Rockefeller Foundation, others saying, how do we do philanthropy in a way that's sustainable? And so there was all these exchanges and things like that. That was actually quite exciting to your point. And it wasn't really covered so much in the media because the typical stuff that's covered is more, some human rights issue or some other, and I'm not saying those things shouldn't be covered, but I'm saying that there's also a lot of other interesting developments that was sort of going underneath. And so I was there at a point where there was a lot happening. And then I happened to be at a time where, yes, I didn't grow up there and I was very honest about it. I kind of, I was coming back and I was trying to explore my cultural heritage. So, but I also was, trying to tell a story about, kind of very sincere wanting to help build up the philanthropy social sector. And sometimes even just how you frame it, right? Like civil society may be a more complicated term, in that context. If you talk about philanthropy, social innovation, maybe you're doing very similar things, but it's maybe more meanable. So things like that, I think also make a difference. And, the fact that I was able to really kind of, become fluent in Chinese and work in that environment, I think that really helped and kind of bring out also this, other aspect of myself that, as I say, that kind of flexibility in your cultural makeup that allows you to bring out different sides of yourself in different contexts.
Yeah.
That I think Canadians or global citizens are often known for. So yeah, so I feel like very grateful to have had a chance to do that at that point, and maybe reading the tea leaves at some point, things were changing, as you're saying, in the broader environment, and at that point I was getting some phone calls from my folks, like 4 years you're deferring, and are you gonna go to this Harvard Law thing, or are you just gonna dangle in front of your Asian parents? And I mean, Harvard Law was also asking, so I thought, okay, this is, maybe a time to make a decision about the next.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that makes sense. And that brings us really back to your journey to the United States. And why did you feel pursued Harvard Law School versus perhaps illegal education in Canada, perhaps, right? What made you feel like you needed to come to the United States for further education?
Yeah, it's a good question, actually. I think maybe I was already on this trajectory of just kind of learning about different parts of the world. It wasn't necessarily by plan, as you can tell from some of these decisions. But, I think it was an interesting time to study law, in particular rule of law. And that was part of the motivation for going to law school, was still very idealistic and hopefully still to some degree today, because you had, kind of what the implications Trump had for what rule of law meant, in the United States. And quite frankly, the reverberations of that around the world, right? And we are seeing some of that, for example, even some of the more authoritarian tendencies in other parts of the world that echoes some of, sort of what happened in the United States. And so it seems to be, kind of a center of gravity. It's obviously has such an impact, not just for Canada, but for the rest of the world. And I was very fortunate to have an opportunity to study there. And yeah, and I was very lucky that, Harvard kept the spot. I don't think people usually defer for that long, but, they were understanding that I was trying to do something meaningful in that time. I wasn't just sitting on the beach, kind of just waiting to go. So, and I think I would say actually to those who are thinking about law school, for me, I benefited tremendously by having time off before going to law school. One, for, practical purpose, you have more, sort of more you're bringing to your applications and experience, but more importantly, you have more clarity of what you want to get out of the law school experience, because sometimes it can be very intense, especially the first year, a bit of an echo chamber. Everybody's trying to, get the top grades, clerkships, all that. Like just having a sense of what is your own project here. There's just so much resources, at Harvard Law School. People study environmental law, animal law, international law. What do you want to get out of it? And for me to have had all those other experiences gave me a clarity that allowed me to say, I want to, ended up being the editor-in-chief of International Law Journal, taught negotiation, sat on the board of APALSA, the Asian American Law Association, which is the largest of its kind in the U.S., and still engaged in some projects related to China. Those kind of things, I think, really benefited from having some time away.
Absolutely. And it makes great sense that you were able to clarify your goals with simply time and experience at the end of the day, that, a fresh young student from undergrad or only 1 year of experience and they're going to Harvard Law might not quite yet figure out, other than perhaps what they've been told as a common path of corporate law or
And you might get
clerkships.
tired. You might be like, I'm just so done with like school, school fatigue. So you're at that point, you're not even, you're kind of just like doing it for the sake of getting the degree. And whereas
Right.
I was like, hey, this might be like my last chance to have an like a structured environment to study what I want. Obviously, you got to do the law stuff. But I was doing
Of course.
cross-interesting classes at the divinity school, at the business school, at
Oh,
Kennedy School, and in a way, COVID, what period of COVID helped because I was actually able to jump between classes on Zoom instead of
mm,
running across the campus and
right.
just have a chance, to study things that, and just appreciate it more as a privilege rather than taking it for granted, I think.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, during your time at Harvard Law School and all these other classes how you took within the Harvard ecosystem, was there a specific or a few specific professors, courses, or experiences that really shaped your career path and perhaps your philosophy on how to build a career and, a successful impact at the end of the day?
There were a number, but just to give an example, the professor I'm working with for this seminar we're teaching, Professor Bill Alford, he's I think now he's in 70s, but and he was a former vice dean at the law school. He has spent his life devoted to you know not just on foreign cultures like China and learning about the laws. He's got an incredible historical background, but also working very practically on something like disability law, which he's done.
Mm,
He used to be on the board of the international the Olympics, but for Paralympics.
well,
But he said I want to do this disability law because when a Harvard law professor is working on it, it creates a certain kind of focus and gets kind of attention for people on an issue that might be not as focused on. And so there are all these big sexy issues about future geopolitics and things like that. But he's also very grounded and also a believer in principled engagement. That idea that you have to stay true to your values individually, as a society, as a country, but doesn't mean that you can't engage, with people that you may disagree with to figure out, how do you navigate the future. So, yeah, he was just as an example of also just a human being, incredible, person. And so having a chance to, kind of learn from him. And I ended up writing a kind of a longer piece that was published by Yale Journal of International Law. I really haven't thought about it for a while, so I'm just mentioning it just now. But it was actually looking at constitutionalism and Confucianism, kind of an obscure topic. But I was basically trying to make the claim that there's oftentimes this argument that Chinese culture or Confucian culture justifies
mhm,
more authoritarian top-down rule,
mm,
and that's why you don't have sort of as much of these democratic and other sort of indigenous sources of more democratic seeds and sentiments and structures. But I was actually trying to make an argument that in some ways, the other side that's really, I'm not just fully denying it, but there's actually many other aspects of, for example, the Confucian tradition, among other, Chinese political, philosophical traditions that actually constrains power. Because
mm,
if you think about the scholar officials, right, they're trying to say the emperor can do this or that. And then
mhm,
there were also the sense of the, kind of like the founding fathers here, right? That these are the ideals of America, the independence, the Constitution. The Confucian scholars looking to an ancient past. There are certain rites and rituals the emperor had to follow. So there are all these kind of constraints that really wasn't examined. So it was just kind of fun to be able to explore a topic that really, may not lead to anything, but it was just interesting to think about how we use history to make arguments about what's possible, what's not possible for society, for countries. So that was also a really, really neat experience.
absolutely. Why did you, I think, you have had these diverse experiences, and you finished out during the height of COVID. What took you away from kind of this perspective on China, on the US, to work in the corporate world, perhaps, right? For our audiences, you started your legal career as a lawyer for Corvath, which for those that are pursuing the legal field, Corvath is often now, I think, generally has been the top ranked law firm in the world on Vault 100, among the most brilliant lawyers. And of course, you're in that field, but you're doing something drastically different from your previous experiences, of course, in social entrepreneurship, perhaps. But you're working in mergers and acquisitions and capital markets. That's not necessarily something you did before. How did that experience translate in some ways, or what prepared you to be able to operate in kind of a completely different career field than your prior professional working experience?
Yeah, that's another great question, Will. And it does seem like how do you connect the dots, right? And it might be that there's part of different people kind of a different personality. Some people really like kind of doing one thing and just having that throughout their life, and maybe there's part of me that enjoys the variety and trying out different sides of myself and exploring, kind of. But more specifically, I think for me, it was actually partly informed by an experience working in the, nonprofit social sector, which is that some of the most competent people who can actually help make an impact were those who have the private sector experiences. They might not completely buy into the ideology of capitalism, free market, rampant free market and all that, but at least they have exposure of how do you, very confidently manage a team? How do you run an operation? How do you write, professional emails, a client service, and be able to see things at very high, these massive deals, mergers of major companies or significant structural changes to enterprises. So it was that sense of like wanting to get some of that professional exposure and training, but hopefully without completely drinking necessarily all of the Kool-Aid that sometimes we see in the media about, or whether in suits or something else like that, right? Um, so I think that's where I was coming from, and I think it was, there are definitely challenging moments, right? And I think you probably heard stories of people who, go do like a year or two big law, and they're like, this is not for me, and they leave, right? And
Right.
and totally understandable, right? They're definitely, the hours, the unpredictability can be tough. And then as well, just generally speaking, I'm not saying any particular firm, just generally speaking for big law sort of, and this is pretty well known. And also, to be frank, the junior associate, the first probably couple years can be sometimes not as intellectually stimulating, right? Because you're like, you know, yeah, you're helping to move the deal forward, but you're like managing signature pages, checklists, kind of like the things that are foundational, but it's not really the high level. This is very different from the 30,000 feet I was at, when I was at Rhodes or Harvard Law School.
Certainly.
And that was actually particularly hard given my age, right? Because I was coming back, remember, having already all these other experiences, being a social entrepreneur, building a team, having all these broader sense of things. So it was just quite a change. And so there were definitely moments that was quite tough, and as you alluded to during COVID. But I think now, a couple more years in as a mid-level, I think, and by the way, I think some of that junior work potentially could be displaced even more by AI. And so we'll see, because
Mm.
that might be a good thing, right? Maybe it means less lawyers, but perhaps the work you do is more engaging even at a very junior level. But in terms of how they learn, it might be different because you're not seeing as much of the grunt, doing diligence 4 a.m, reading through every change of control contract, change of control provision. But, as a mid-level, then I felt like, okay, you're getting more exposure. You're having understand, you're starting to work on the main merger agreement, which are very complex. So you're improving your drafting skills. You're doing deal management because you're managing junior associates, paralegals. You're, as an M&A lawyer, you're shepherding all these specialists,
Hmm.
regulatory, IP, real estate, tax. And so you have to understand all these different challenges, and you take more ownership. And so,
Right.
for example, by the time I got to Paul Weiss, where I'm based now, really got to work with some really cool deals, projects. For example, Intel and Apollo did a $11 billion joint venture to build semiconductor facilities, in Ireland, right? And so that was just a fascinating project of two very, a large private equity and firm, and then Intel, and trying to do this, and how do you
Yeah.
think about all these different pieces, or Sony Apollo, for example, did a bid for Paramount Studios. Like,
Mm.
that was very much on the news, and it was just interesting to be part of that. And then working now on some AI projects as well with Meta and Amazon. For
Mm.
example, some of it is actually not necessarily corporate M&A, but more regulatory. So, for example, there's a new country with legislation about how do you is this the legislation that we should have? How does it compare to the
Mm.
EU and other places? And on behalf of our client, we'll actually mark up the legislation, say, this is maybe that will work better for different stakeholders. And so, and then obviously there's a pro bono practice you develop as well, like helping with asylum seekers and things like that. So
Certainly.
I think, like, who knows what the future holds. But in terms of when you really kind of then get more into it, you develop in this practice where you kind of developing more judgment, strategic perspective on things, and you developing expertise, right? And I
Yeah.
think there's that something about the legal. I'm not, not saying anything against consultants or other, they're teach their own and their benefits to all that, but I think there's a substantive aspect of being a lawyer, and you get that
Right.
really great training in this environment, and then, people can go in many different directions from there.
Certainly. So I think for our audience, especially those law students listening in, perhaps from an accomplished lawyer being a part of our program, what is the role of the lawyer who, is facilitating this M&A deal? Perhaps if you can, at a very broad level, run us through in a quick 2 minute, piece, if you can. But
Yeah.
like, what does the lawyer do for that M&A deal at that like 10,000 feet level?
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's a great question. And quite honestly, it took me a while to figure it out, even when I started, because, there's different contexts. But by and large, we're talking about M&A deal, right? And there's also the business side of it, the financial side. And those oftentimes are at the two tail ends, right? So if a client decides to make an acquisition or merge, that's kind of early stage, even before they engage with the lawyers. And then on the very other end, once the transaction takes place, for example, how do you get, two companies to actually integrate properly, culturally, otherwise? That's also
Right.
more of the business, and everything between. That's where I think the lawyers really have the most value added, right? Which is, okay, now there's an interest in making an acquisition, in making
Mhm.
combination, but, what are all the different considerations, legal and otherwise, right? And that's actually, the lawyer actually plays a role beyond just the legal. But starting with that, the regulatory aspect, right? The tax aspect, which is huge. How do we structure this so that, that makes the most sense for the client? How do you deal with potential, now there's so many regulatory, so antitrust, right? CFIUS, all these questions about, can you actually get this deal done in the time that the client wants? And then thinking about, this governance pieces, right? How, once you combine, who's going to have the rights on the new board, what kind of rights they have, and how do you design in a way that meets the needs of all the different parties? How do you go about the negotiation process? So there's everything then, sort of like the initial letter of intent, the bidding stage. If you go through with that and the target decides, okay, we're going to go forward, then you have an exclusive negotiation, and there's a lot of negotiations that kind of mixes both the business and legal terms. So you're negotiating term sheets, negotiating these, sometimes even merger agreement drafts before you actually, then if you decide to go forward, then you're actually then, there are these primary legal documents, the merger agreement, there are all these disclosure schedule and disclosure agreements, and it's a lot to manage. It's a lot to manage, and sometimes can be very complicated with a lot of sort of business terms encoded into a legalese that can,
Mhm.
kind of protect your interest in this kind of U.S. corporate New York, Delaware system, because that's something right critical to rule of law, that you have that predictability and that you have the ability to resolve these
Right.
issues, right? Whether it's litigation later or other things. So how you draft something, one word could change, could be a huge difference for a client in terms of, these significant deals that are $1 billion sometimes. So that's just to give a flavor of what are some of the pieces involved.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned earlier, you've worked on major deals like Intel and Apollo, Sony and Apollo, and of course, some very like relevant topics with artificial intelligence for some of the biggest firms that are, making advancements in this very new and fast-moving field. And you did that here in New York, and but you chose in this also, a few years into your legal career, you shifted your practice from New York to Toronto. What was that experience like? What was the calculus to move back home, right, closer to home in that respects? And how did you end up integrating kind of this international law practice there in that as well, right? I think most people like would want to have a high level career, especially primarily based in New York, because that's where the major law firms are. But you made the decision to move back closer to home. So would love for us to know a little bit about your decision on that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a totally fair question. In some ways, we have all these other sides of ourselves as the professional, trying to be successful and whatnot. And I, if I've really met that, but at least there's also this personal fulfillment side and, where's home. And so for me, it came to, just wanting to be closer to family, to my loved ones. and got a little baby sister. She's like graduating soon, and kind of closer to my family, and also Canada. Honestly, is a great place for those who, you know, depending on how it goes in what's going on here in the U.S. Folks are thinking about moving to Canada for a period. Like it's, I know a lot of people. There are a lot of challenges right now, even within Canada. For
Mm,
folks in terms of cost of living, housing. So there are legitimate challenges, but for someone who grew up here, I just feel, definitely a stake, in even the future of this, place, and in a way, because, for example, there's so much going on between U.S. and Canada in terms of cross-border transactional activities in a way, because so even though I'm based in Toronto, I'm still working a lot with the New York, M&A teams. And so I'm just grateful to have a chance to still draw on this, kind of training to be able to work across these different, contexts. And yeah, and then also hopefully over time, I can also contribute back home in some ways, being back in Canada and Toronto. For example, recently I joined the board of FACO, which is Federation of Asian Canadian Lawyers. There's an equivalent in US called the PABA. And something that Justice Goodwin Liu did, Supreme Court Justice of California, is looking at the portrait of Asian American lawyers in the US. And kind of, you start out with so many talented students, and then over time, much less corporate law firm partners, general
mm,
counsels, and other leadership roles. So
right.
that's something that I'm excited, to kind of work on with FACO on our Canadian side to see, can we study that and what are the particular challenges and opportunities there, getting involved with, over time with things like, given my international relations background, the um, Canadian International Council, which is sort of our equivalent of the, Brookings or Council of Foreign Relations. We
I
don't have
see.
as much resources, to be honest, but still, there's Canada as a G7, as a G20 country, and NATO. We still have an important, I think, role to play, in this very divided world. So coming back to kind of what we were talking about earlier. And so one, to be more engaged with the community back home, but then two, to also think about, so what is the role that we can play in the world, given, these other experiences I've had, international, legal, and so those are some of the things that I think are driving me to this new chapter, and quite excited. Yeah.
Yeah, and you've kept your hands full of so many different initiatives that you're doing, but bringing us back to Harvard is now you're teaching, co-teaching a class with a renowned legal professor at Harvard Law School. For the students who might one day aspire to be lecturers or teachers themselves, how did that come about? It's clearly in line with, of course, your passion on international law, your experiences in China, of course, but how did this come about? Merely 3 years after you graduated Harvard Law School yourself.
Right. I think it's also one of those kind of a lot of serendipitous things in life. It's not something, I planned, and obviously feel tremendous gratitude, working. I actually, was part of me that thought about maybe doing some legal academia, earlier or later in my career, with Professor Alford. I think he's very kind to say, you have these really interesting experiences before even law school, working on the ground in China, building a social enterprise, working in other places. And so maybe he valued that experience. And then, but you still have to kind of propose, to the Harvard Law School curriculum committee, which, I'm sure
Right.
is quite selective and not always easy to. So yeah, so I think a lot of things had to align, and I was very fortunate to have this chance. So and I'm also grateful, to be honest, with my law firm, which is supportive, right? Because just to have a chance to still do this, even as a very busy associate, but hopefully, it's manageable, given that I'm working with such a tremendous professor, so much experience. So I think this is one of my broader points, perhaps I'll share, is that I feel like that Steve Jobs quote or Kierkegaard, few people talked about how you can't connect the dots looking forward and only connect looking backwards. This very much was true, right? That 4 years I spent in China, it felt like completely, and to be honest, as a, Asian, son, like it was not easy, because I was not going to law school. I was thinking maybe not even to go to Harvard Law. I was deferring. My parents were like, what are you doing, kind of
Hmm.
going there and working in the nonprofit? Like, you're not even making money, like really much money. So
Yeah.
there was a lot of even challenges on a personal level.
Right.
it just felt to me like this was something, yeah, maybe higher risk, but I think I will learn more even if I'm not getting some other benefits, but I also realized how privileged I was to take that real risk. And I acknowledge not everyone has those opportunities. So I just feel that when you have those opportunities in life, can try to lean into it. Oftentimes it leads to, kind of really unique things. And for me in this case, the chance to, kind of then draw upon it and later on, because it's almost like, it's like much later some of these things emerge and percolate. So you kind of have to trust the process, the journey along the
Right.
way. And so, yeah, that's what I would say is that just kind of not be afraid to challenge some of the more conventional norms, right? Because I know for like a lot of, for example, minorities, like, there's certain stereotypes, be a good doctor, a good lawyer, good, kind of accountant, finance, whatever. And just kind of try to say, really take the time to reflect. And it took me a lot of time, as you can see with this journey, to look through all these different parts of my life and to say, what is it unique about myself? What are some gifts that I've been given? And how can I make my own difference, my own unique way? And, it's so easy sometimes in this age of social media to compare with everyone's like, and, how am I doing? And I'm certainly guilty of that sometimes, even subconsciously, but just to realize like everyone is on their own sort of path, right? And running their own race and different starting points, different endpoints. And so just kind of trying to be true to yourself in that sense, and
Hmm.
trust that things will work out and the path will unfold, right? And like as Martin Luther King, I think, said, kind of all you have to do is just take the next step, and kind of the staircase
Hmm.
will start to reveal that path for you.
Absolutely. What does kind of the future look like for yourself beyond, your current corporate, career in law to you teaching? What do you feel most fulfilled by? Kind of a metric for success. What is a fulfilling life? What is success for you at the end of the day, personal and professional?
Yeah, it's a great question, Will. I feel like that question merits a lot more reflection on my part, but I'll give just a very initial reaction. Um, Obviously, I'm very happily gainfully employed, so really grateful to be where I am now. And more broadly speaking about things that matter to me, I think it's just recognizing that that there are a lot of things that confront our societies more broadly. For example, coming back from Asia now to the West, like Western democracies
Right.
are facing so many challenges with the rise of more extreme forms of populism and what is the impact of AI on, our society, the good and bad. How do we adapt to
Yeah.
that? And how do Western democracies cope with, regimes that are of different nature and how do you engage with them? And so, to me, it's just feeling like, having this education to be able to think critically about these issues, to be an informed and engaged citizen, even though you're not doing something, full time in something, and play the role that you're uniquely suited to play. And for me, if I can be an advocate, be a voice for those who don't have one, and to be able to give back in some way, to Canada, which has given me so much, and then also Canada's place in the world, and how do we move towards ultimately, I think, some kind of world peace, which probably is very difficult given the world we're in, but I think
Yeah.
still an ideal worth preserving. And so maybe in some ways it's trying to maintain some kind of idealism and hope, even in this very sometimes tragic sort of world we're living in. And so I think that's important. And then otherwise, I think just kind of being able to wake up and be surrounded by people you love and who love you, and work on something that you really feel is long term meaningful, and can have an impact, maybe even when we're not around anymore, on this earth. So trying to remind myself of that, even the day to day might not always be like that, but you have your north stars, and just come from a place of, I think, gratitude and awe. I think that's a lot, and just a lot to be thankful for.
Absolutely. Well, we have spoken long past what we had initially anticipated. I think there's so much opportunities to talk about from your current work to teaching at Harvard Law School, but I think we've arrived at a very good spot. And I want to thank you, Stephen, for sharing your insights and your journey for perhaps some of the students who will be taking your lecture, your seminar this fall. to many others who perhaps might be interested in following your path and as they continue to discover their own professional journey and how they feel they want to make an impact.
Thank you so much, Will. I really, really appreciate this really terrific conversation. I thought you asked some really interesting questions I haven't thought about, in some time or before really. And so, definitely a lot of food for thought, for this journey we're all on. And it's great that you're providing this platform for so many people who, like myself, first timers, get to share a little bit of our story and ideas with folks. And yeah, definitely look forward to continuing the conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you, Stephen. And thank you for sharing your experiences and insights from beyond Harvard Square, from beyond Harvard Law School to our listeners.
Take care.